I would like to ask our Mayor Emerson to be our grand host for this evening. Will you welcome us up?
Thank you, Gretchen. Good evening. First, I'd like to thank those that signed up to serve on this task force. You are doing a valuable service for your city, and we thank you for doing this. And for the rest of you that have signed in, you obviously have interest in housing, and I hope you will continue to stay engaged with us. I'd like to remind everybody about the fundamental role that housing plays in three ways: in the health, safety, and well-being of our residents, in the educational achievement of our youth and future leaders, and in the overall stability in the community. When we have stable housing for all, our residents thrive, and so does our city. So I hope we will continue to work for that goal, and I will get off the thing and turn it back to Gretchen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to take a minute to welcome everyone. Again, this is the City of White Bear Lake Community Housing Forum #1. It's a part 1 of a part 2 series of housing forums. We'll be, as Anne mentioned, this is a webinar format, so we'll be only having visuals of the panel and key speakers. Those of you who are here in attendance will be able to participate through the Q&A. And we hope this will be a helpful and informative session. I want to just begin by having some introductions. We have a stellar panel who will be providing much of the information today, and but I'll hold off on them for right now. Firstly, to introduce the city staff that are participating with this project: Ellen Hineker, City Manager, Ann Kane, and Tracy Shimmick, our fantastic staff that we have been working with through this housing task force process. And tonight, my name is Gretchen Nichols with the Local Initiative Support Corporation, and Barbara Ray with the Center for Policy Planning and Performance will be assisting with the facilitation and oversight of the session tonight. We have a phenomenal task force of 20 members from the community that we have been super grateful for their interest and time and insights about community needs and desires. And we had invited Mary Davis to be kind of sharing the work of the task force. She's not here yet, so maybe let's hold off on that for right now and just go ahead and hand it off to Barbara for the overview of the agenda and protocols.
All right, thanks everyone. I want to do just a couple of housekeeping pieces. So if you have a question for the panelist, would you submit that through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen? And then if you have technical questions that you really want the staff to help answer, you can submit those in the chat, which is also a little button at the bottom of your screen. So we're trying to capture everybody's questions, but we want the panelists to know what you might be asking them. This is the first of 2 community forums, as Gretchen mentioned, and this is primarily information gathering. So we have a panel of experts who will share with you their expertise, and we've prompted them with a few questions, but then we'll have a Q&A section at the end toward the end of the meeting where they'll be able to answer your questions directly. And the date for the second forum, which is a little more interactive, will be September 9th. So if you want to put that on your calendar. Well,
Barbara,
yes?
I'm sorry, Mary Davis is here now. So when you find a pause, we can invite
Okay,
her.
well, I'll just do the last protocol piece. There will be a post-session survey with just a few questions that'll be sent to you, and you can give us feedback. We always use your input to design the next session to make sure it better meets your needs. So I'll stop there.
Great.
And we'll hear from Mary.
Yeah, we'd like to introduce Mary Davis, who is a member of the Housing Task Force. Mary, will you introduce yourself? Hi.
Hi, I'm Mary. Sorry I'm late. I was having internet issues. Okay, so I'm gonna go straight into it. So I'm Mary Davis. I am a White Bear Lake Housing Task Force member. The White Bear Lake Housing Task Force was created to provide recommendations to the City Council on housing policies, programs, and development priorities. In April 2021, a 20-member housing task force was appointed. All members expressed a common interest in housing and reconciliation of its importance to the community vitality, while bringing a diverse set of housing experiences and perspectives. Some members of the group have professional experience in various aspects of housing, while others do not. The committee seeks to balance a variety of voices and viewpoints, each being equally important to the process, reflecting our community as a whole. In addition to the monthly Housing Task Force meetings, 2 community forums will be held, including this one, to engage a broader community in this process. This process will also run parallel with the city's welcoming and inclusive community initiative and necessarily intersect along the way. The health and vitality of our community are dependent upon representing the needs of all its residents and recognizing the existence of structural disparities. To date, the Housing Task Force has reviewed the city's 2040 Comprehensive Plan, a comprehensive housing market study, the finding from the online community housing survey, and shared our own personal stories about our housing experiences. As we move toward drafting our recommendations, we will consider policies that focus on 3 goals: the preservation of existing housing stock, expanding housing options, and creating livable and walkable areas to include scale, design, and sustainability. Affordability is another key topic as housing values and rent continues to increase faster than wages. On behalf of the task force, thank you all for joining the conversation this evening and to the panel for sharing your enterprise. We look forward to hearing your stories and considering creative ways to achieve our housing goals.
Great, thanks, Mary. Gretchen, if you can go back to the agenda.
Oops, sorry. There you go.
Great. I just wanted jump in. So tonight it's an opportunity to hear from people with experience in the areas that have been identified by the task force or are identified in the White Bear Lake Comp Plan or in a housing study they did recently or through a resident survey. And that was a self-selected response process, but we do have some themes that people are looking for. So we'll hear from them and then we'll have this open Q&A. And again, reminder, put your question in the Q&A and we have the staff people looking at the questions and they'll be offering them so that we've got a little organization in that. So I'm just going to introduce the people based on the order there on the agenda. Stacie, and your last name is Kvilvang. She's with Ehlers, but before that worked for Brooklyn Park for 10 years and has a lot of experience around housing and apartment rehabilitation and paving the way for various programs that can be used in communities today. Andrew Dresdner is with Cuningham Group. He has 20 years of experience in urban design and urban planning, so we'll be able to hear some ideas from him as well about how public places can be created and how development can fit or match some of the cultural style of a community that people care about. Then I think we have Jeanne. Right. John Belisle is a current board member and former chair of the Washington County Community Development Agency. He's been a developer of market rate and affordable multifamily communities. He has worked with MICA, which is a housing advocacy organization, and he's also been with an international accounting firm. So he's got financial policy and also some advocacy experience. Sarah Harris is an executive vice president at Aeon. She has provided leadership with various organizations, including working with the University of Minnesota Foundation Real Estate Advisors. She's launched with the Minneapolis Downtown Improvement District and has served with many community organizations as a board member. Stephanie Hawkinson is with the Affordable Housing Development. She is the Affordable Housing Development Manager with the City of Edina. And she has been working there as director for the past 3 years. She has knowledge of both the developer and the public funding process. So we have another person who can share with us how things really happen and what financial resources and how things get put together. She's also been with the director of the housing development and with a private consulting firm. Jeanne Kelsey is a housing and economic development program manager for the city of Roseville. She has served in various positions there, but she currently is the housing and economic development program manager. And she's worked as a commercial real estate broker and also has and can bring some of that private sector awareness to what she and we are trying to do within the context of city economic and housing development. We're going to ask each person to just share 5 to 7 minutes about what they're doing and how their business or city works and how they've been addressing housing and housing policy. And they've each been given just a couple of questions to prompt the conversation. Just for your information, their bios and the background information will be made available to you, so you don't have to keep incredible notes or figure out how to print from a Zoom call. So let's just start maybe in the order that we read them. Gretchen, is that?
Yep.
We're doing it. So Stacie, do you want to start?
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Gretchen, and great. Well, I wish I could see all the task members, but it's nice to see some of the city staff that we work closely with. I work for a firm called Ehlers and Associates. We are a public financing firm, and so we only represent public clients. We work with the public clients with regards to long-range financial management planning, debt issuance, tax increment financing, redevelopment plans, housing initiatives, and basically anything else that our clients need assistance with. I was really tasked with a couple of things to give perspective on, and the first one is really how should you as a community look at housing finance? And I would say this to anybody that is out there is that really when you think about housing finance, it's for all types of housing. So it is for your single family homes, it is for townhomes if you have any condos, it's also for your apartments and any senior cooperatives. So it's just not for just one sector or portion or tenure of type of housing that you actually have. And I think the biggest thing to remember is that anything related to housing finance is that it is an investment in your community that you absolutely will get a return on. Okay, so your housing stock is probably your strongest base that you have. And so it's all about the people that live there and make your community what it is and its vibrancy that it has. That's not to throw any shade on any of the commercial development because that's equally important. But again, without a solid housing stock or housing options for residents that they want to live in or desire to have, or if it's not kept up, you're going to have issues within your community. So it's really any dollars that you put out, you are probably going to get back threefold in some type of return, not only on a financial basis, but just keeping your community something that is a desirable place that people want to come and live and look at. The other thing with housing finance is really when cities get involved, look at it as, really gap financing, right? You're coming in to assist where the private market can't get the funding on their own. So all the housing developers that are out there, they're all very savvy, and they are all looking forward to go to different, sources to bring all those dollars together. Not only their own private equity, but they are looking for other grant resources out there. But again, you as a city or community, is when you have dollars that are available, you're trying to figure out where do you want to fill that gap or take the barriers away for the type of development that you want to see in your community. It's not necessarily what the developer wants, but it's, again, what you're trying to do and attract in your community. And then, the thing with dollars, we always say it doesn't have to be a grant. Everything doesn't have to be a giveaway with regards to it. You can do things with your dollars that may be loans, so that, again, you can start recuperating those dollars, so you get a loan pool that you can start putting back out into the community and get returns on, and just have an ongoing source. So when we look like, well, how do you get money, right? Or what are the funding sources that you have for it? The one that you guys have used and not a ton in your community is tax increment financing. And that's probably the biggest tool that communities have that's available to assist in housing projects. What I can say in the metro is that it's primarily used for rental projects for apartments, and it's used for 100% affordable projects. It's used for senior projects. It's used for senior projects with services, and it's used for market rate housing. Again, it's all trying to attract the type of development that you want to see in your community. And just the basics of tax increment is that what you have out there for property today, there is a value, and they're paying taxes on that. And once you take away what's on that site and build something new, there's an increased value. And basically, you're able to capture the taxes from that increased value to provide to a developer, such as Aeon, who's on the line, that they can use to capitalize to get their affordable housing project done. And typically, most cities do that on what's called a pay-as-you-go basis. So it's a non-risk proposition for cities to be able to utilize those dollars. The developer goes out and capitalize it, and then as they pay their taxes, they get a rebate twice a year with regards to that. And then what we call tax increment light is tax abatement, and that is very similarly treated. However, you can abate up to 100% of the property taxes for a specific project or parcel. This doesn't get used as much, especially for housing deals, but, essentially we have seen it used in outstate and other areas for housing rehab programs, because it's the ability for you to abate your portion or the city portion of taxes. So if they want to invest in a certain amount of rehab or significant rehab, we work close with the city of Duluth and their assessor, where we could see an increase of value happening from that significant rehabilitation to make those homes more marketable or more up to date for what people would like to see with open floor plans. And we could show that there's a return on that investment for an abatement over a period of time of giving those homeowners that were willing to make that investment a rebate of their taxes. So, the private market, residents were putting their money in, but the city was willing to come to the table as well. One of the other things is, you can have an HRA or EDA levy, and I think, Ann, you guys have an HRA? No EDA? Okay. Either.
Sorry, we do have an HRA, we just don't have a levy.
Yep. So you have an HRA, and so what you have is the ability is to levy under the HRA statute, and those dollars are specifically for housing programs and use that you have. So if you looked at an HRA levy for your community, it would be about $265,000 a year that you could retain and start building a fund to go out and do projects. I can tell you, $265,000 doesn't go that far. But, in 4 years or so, you can build up, to, $750,000 to $1 million. And then you start to have something as far as a loan pool or programs that you can wrap around that to provide assistance to get housing either developed or rehabbed within your community. And then the other way you could do it is you could just have a general tax levy. So again, it's another tax increase, but that can be an unlimited amount on the general fund budget. So that's more of a political difficulty to get through. Most cities are used to doing an EDA or HRA levy because it's really succinct in what it's supposed to be utilized for. But other cities have been bold to use general levy dollars when they've had significant issues that they've wanted to address. And then finally, there's grants out there. So, the Metropolitan Council, the state of Minnesota, the DNR, everybody tends to have grants that are out there. And again, most private developers or nonprofits can't access those grants without a public partner. So that's where they're going to come to the city when they have a project, and what they're going to be looking for is getting a resolution of support and assistance from the city staff to be able to go and apply for those. So with that, Gretchen and Barbara, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Terrific. Thanks, Stacie. And I bet there are people who have follow-up questions, so we'll come back to you. It's great information. Andrew, you're up.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share the stage with the panel and to be in front of the community. So thank you all very much. So my name's Andrew Dresdner. I work for Cuningham Group. Cuningham is a planning and design firm in Minneapolis. And I'm a planner and an urban designer, and you might ask what an urban designer does. So I think the best way to describe it, or at least the way I often describe it, is an urban designer designs the arrangement of buildings, spaces, and infrastructure, not necessarily the design of any one of those elements, but rather the arrangement and the relationships between them. So I think a lot about whether, for example, the street should be on this side of the building or that side of the building, or whether the park should be next to transit, or should the housing be in between park and transit, and things like that. And the reason I think that is so important is because it's that arrangement and that relationship between those elements that sets up the daily patterns of life in any town or any city, really sets up the rhythm of that place. And I would also argue that setting up those daily patterns and that rhythm is much of the reason why people are attracted to certain communities. So anyway, you can go to the next slide. But we're here to talk a little bit about housing. So I want to share with you just a few thoughts about that, about cities housing, and some things to think about as White Bear Lake evolves into the next version of yourself. First of all, it's essential for every community to provide that range of housing, everything from your first home to your last home and everything in between. The reason why that's so important is because without that range, it's hard to both attract residents and it's even harder to retain residents. And that's important, of course, because if you don't retain residents throughout their many stages of life, it puts great stress on all the services that support those residents, whether that is your local businesses, your churches, your houses of worship, or just your parks and libraries. Now, the problem is that many of our communities offer just a narrow segment of the housing market. And so the housing, I don't believe the housing in White Bear Lake is as one-dimensional as some communities, but I believe it's set up with a lot of houses for families when they're large. They're at their sort of largest, you know, the large family or the largest, that phase of life. And the problem is that we only need that housing, frankly, for a small portion of our adult life, if we need it at all. Some of us don't get to that 2.5 kids per household. So chances are you have somewhat of a mismatch in White Bear Lake. And I would argue that even if you don't have a mismatch, if your housing stock is one-dimensional, you'll forever have to cope with a lot of community turnover as people move through their different stages of life. So this is one important piece. So the second thing I want to talk about is about how you as a community can welcome new housing into White Bear Lake. Or if you're the developer, frankly, how you can be welcomed into the community. So I mentioned I'm a designer and I think a lot about design, and design matters a lot. But what really matters, I think, is not so much design, but rather the performance and the outcome of that design. So there are many ways to measure performance or outcome. And I'll talk a moment about just the four you see on the right, because these are four areas that I guess in my experience, I think communities and developers can have healthy dialogue around. So remember, housing is simply, we're talking about housing here, but housing, as you know, is simply a piece of a larger puzzle. The larger puzzle is your community, and you're looking for performance and outcomes that register on a community scale. So I pose these sort of four on the right-hand side as four to discuss. So you go to the next slide. So the first one is healthy or healthy communities. And the question here is how can housing have a discussion about how can it contribute to a more healthy community? There are many ways. When we think about housing, I think about things like, does housing provide access to recreational opportunities? Or for that matter, can simply walking out of the front of my house and walking to my job be my exercise for the day? or do I have to drive to exercise? And can housing, another question might be, how can housing be located close to essential health services? Or for that matter, can health services be located within the housing itself? All these play into this issue of how to create healthy communities. And when we look at the actual building itself, we think about things like, how can housing be designed with non-toxic materials? Can it provide access to healthy food, healthy homegrown foods directly on site for that matter? So housing and healthy communities have this very, very close relationship to each other, and one that developers and communities, I believe, should engage in. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Next issue we talk about a lot is authenticity. And this is a hard one because it is a squishy word, but by authenticity, I mean housing that is of a place and of the people. So I always encourage architects and within my own company and others and developers to think about the history and the culture of the community that they are living in or that they are going to want to propose housing in. And think about ways in which that history can be reflected in your project. Using art, of course, is one excellent way to interpret that history and interpret that culture. It's a great way to ground any project into a community. Or you can think about that geography. I think often about what are the local materials, not necessarily the ones that are cheapest to get, but what are the ones that are from that area? What are the local craftsmen working on? What are they particularly skilled at? How can your project use those elements, reflect those elements and use those skills? How can your project respond to local climate? Surely, I mean, all our projects in Minnesota respond to climate because they're tight and they have high insulation values and they have, you have to design places to push the snow. But I think good design that is authentic to a place can do more than just figuring out where to push the snow. I think that buildings that use local materials, local craftsmen in the response to the particular environmental conditions that they're in, those are the ones that we look at and we say, that's a building that belongs in White Bear Lake. And I think when we can say that's a building that belongs, when a community can say that, they're more likely to welcome that project into a community. Go to the next one. Sociable is another outcome that we always strive for in our designs. Most communities want their neighborhoods and their housing to be neighborly. They want them to promote social bonds between neighbors and between strangers. Of course, Minnesota is known as a place throughout the country as a place with high social capital, a place with those kind of invisible bonds that keep society moving forward. So when we think about housing, I often think about can we do housing that is outward facing, housing that doesn't project an image of a fortress or a wall to the community. Are there spaces such as some you may see here that we can design into a housing project or into the neighborhood that can support sociability? And there's a bit of a difference. By sociability, one of the things I think it's important to focus on is it's not just interaction between people who know each other, but it's interaction between strangers as well. So housing with stoops and porches and front patios that put eyes on the street and that allow both neighbors and strangers to simply wave to each other is another way to create sociable housing and another way to welcome housing into a community. And then the final item I want to talk about just briefly is prosperity or prosperous housing. And this could be controversial in a lot of discussions I have, but I encourage communities to define what prosperous means for themselves. It may or it may not relate to upward mobility. I think that's important. It might be measured by social networks and access to education or access to jobs, or even whether a community has a strong entrepreneurial support network. So depending on how a community defines that, housing can play a very significant role. It can start simply with a discussion of affordability and the ability to live simply, thereby giving a household or an individual the ability to allocate resources to places other than rent or mortgage. So it can be just about affordability, but it can also mean designing housing that has workspaces within it. And we call that live-work housing. The image on the right sort of a classic live-work building where you literally live above and you work below. So having your workplace nearby can be one way to promote individual or household prosperity. It can also mean housing with low barriers to ownership, or housing with any bevy of cooperative housing opportunities. So this is so I guess in conclusion, what I want to say is that for White Bear Lake, continue to provide that range of housing so that people can remain in your community through all phases of life. And when you have these discussions with developers and about housing projects, if you focus on those 4 items, healthy places, sociable places, authentic places, and prosperous communities, it's a way to have productive and effective dialogue.
Great, thank you. Yes, I'm going to keep us moving along. So, John?
I'll be brief. Just briefly, I moved into the area 27 years ago. I only say that I was a renter in White Bear Lake. And I only bring that up to remind people that we were all renters at one time. And oftentimes as a developer, when we bring a rental project forward, people show up and they don't want it. And I think they forget that they were once a renter. And I just bring it up now so folks, when they have that instant reaction, that they just take a pause and think about it for a minute and say, I guess I was a renter once and maybe this isn't such a bad thing. As far as my prompts were, what are the challenges and opportunities in White Bear Lake? And the challenges obviously are, it's a built out community. So it's primarily infill development that you need to do. And that could be both a challenge and an opportunity from my perspective. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but so what happens is obviously the easiest sites get developed first. And so the most difficult ones get developed later. And that oftentimes is brownfields and contaminated sites. And White Bear, like most communities, has some of those that need cleanup. And of course, because that's expensive, they get done later. But for White Bear, I think that's a great opportunity to get some of these developments done on brownfields because you don't have any other land. And you've got vacant property that doesn't generate any property taxes at all or very little. And so it's a great opportunity for White Bear. So I hope people look at that positively and not negatively and see all the opportunity. As far as, I guess the other prompt for me was, what development would I consider doing in White Bear Lake? Well, as an example, 11 years ago, we opened Hoffman Place, which is just north of the Stadium Bar and Village. That's a 60-unit workforce housing / affordable, depends on your terminology, that we opened 11 years ago. And that's been full with no vacancies basically for 11 years. So we would look to do something like that, moderate income. We're an apartment maybe for folks in the income range from $35,000 to $60,000 household income. I think that's about it, if we can find the right lot to build it on. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, John. Sarah from Aeon.
Sarah, are you muted?
Sorry about that. I was just saying that Mark Twain said I didn't have enough time to write a shorter book. And, this is such an incredibly important topic. I so appreciate everybody taking the time to have this discussion when it's not focused on a particular project, but rather the bigger, broader issue. And the challenge is it's a really complicated and nuanced discussion, and it's hard to fit it into a short amount of time. So I'm going to do my best. If you can go to the next slide, Gretchen. Aeon was actually formed when the Minneapolis Convention Center, in the process of being built, demolished a significant amount of affordable housing in downtown Minneapolis. And so the downtown faith congregations formed Aeon so that we could start to replace that housing. And now some 35, 40 years later, Aeon has just under 5,600 units of housing, and we serve 15,000 people. And I would just note that over 3,000 of our homes were acquired or built in the last 4 years. So we have had significant growth as we have tried to meet the needs of the community. And the other thing I would note is that fully 40% of our residents in those almost 6,000 homes are folks that are earning less than 30% of the area median income. And I'm sorry to use all of these technical terms, but that's really important. That means that the majority of those residents are earning the lowest income bracket, and they are the ones that are having the hardest time finding affordable housing, because affordable housing is a very broad definition. Next, Gretchen. So there are 3 types of affordable housing that we work on. We focus on new construction of buildings that, for the most part, uses what we call the low income housing tax credit, or LIHTC. Those are tax credits that are administered by the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and at the present time, they are prioritizing the use of those credits on properties that are building those most deeply supportive units. So for those residents that are earning that lowest bracket of income. The other kind of property we are working on, and the cause of that majority of our growth in those last 4 years, is what we call NOAH, the naturally occurring affordable housing. And I know everybody on this call knows these buildings. They were, built before the 1990s. So think 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. These are the buildings that are really well loved, but maybe not as well maintained. And in many cases, it's just they're buildings that are low amenity, and as a result of being older buildings, their rents have been kept affordable. But what we've started to see in the last 8 or so years is that market investors from the coasts as well as locally see the opportunity to buy these properties, quickly upscale them, and then quickly raise the rents. And that not only displaces the families that are living in these buildings. Once displaced, those families are scattered, and it ripples through the local school system, it ripples through the local workforce, and before you know it, you're kind of upsetting all of the different systems in the community, in addition to now having more families that are needing to find affordable housing, for which there's already a waiting list. The third kind of housing is preservation, and this is not historic preservation. This is preservation of housing units that have been kept affordable through some form of a legal agreement. But all of those legal agreements will expire at some point at the end of whatever the compliance period is. And when those agreements expire, those units are at risk of having their rents raised quickly, either by the current owner, or they recognize that their building will now have more value and they can sell it into the market. And so these are the kinds of affordable housing that we've been focused on. Gretchen, next. Thank you. I'm going to go through a lot of facts and figures here quickly. I'm sorry to do that, but I think it helps to level set the conversation. The new housing that is built in our community costs about $350,000 a unit to build, and these numbers are going to start to increase as construction prices have really been going through the roof recently. And as a community, we build about 1,500 units of these new construction houses each year in Minnesota, and that's limited by the available tax credits and other funding sources. The NOAH properties, those acquisitions that I talked about, it costs about $150,000 to per unit to buy and rehab these buildings. So you can see there's a significant cost savings to acquire and maintain affordability versus to build new. But we are losing about, on average, 4,000 or so of these units per year in our community. They're being sold to the market buyers. And so it doesn't take a math genius to understand that if we're only building 1,500 units as a community and we're losing 4,000 units as a community, the math is not working in our favor. And then you add to that, the Met Council says that in addition to that net loss of units, they are also projecting an increase in our population of just over 37,000 households that will need affordable housing by 2030. And so we have a very significant need for affordable housing in our community. And I would point out that of those new households from that population growth, it's projected that 40% of them will be in the affordable category, and less than earning less than 80% of that area median income, which means they need the deepest affordability when they're looking for housing. And lastly, at the present time in our community, 1/3, so think about that, 1/3 of the households in our community are cost burdened. What does that mean? That means they're spending more than 30% of their income on their housing costs. And in many cases, they're paying more than 50% of their income on housing costs. And that means they are one life event away from losing their housing. If they have a car issue, if they lose a job, whatever that life event is, they're at risk of being destabilized in their housing. Next. So what can communities do to help? Gap funding is always the challenge. New housing is very expensive, and we need to fill gaps when we're building. The purchase of the NOAA housing, the challenge there is we have to compete with the market. So we have to pay market prices to buy these buildings, but we aren't going to raise the rents the way the market would. And so that creates an instant gap because we can only afford so much capital because of our rents, whereas the market can afford much more capital to buy these properties because they're going to raise their rents. So we have to look for different sources of gap funding. A lot of cities and counties have affordable housing trust funds. Stacie mentioned earlier the use of tax increment financing. That is a very important tool to close the gap. The federal government provides home funds to cities and counties to administer, and those home funds are used to build and buy housing for the deeply, deeply supportive units, folks earning less than 30%. And in many cases, folks who have various types of challenges, whether it's mental health, chemical health, or long-term homelessness. And then another important role that cities and counties could play would be to use the strength of their balance sheet to guarantee a certain portion of a debt payment to a lender or some form of guarantee to lower the risk to investors. And when the risk is lowered, it lowers the interest rates that we have to pay for that funding because the risk is lower, and that allows us to support getting more debt and more equity for the project. In the corporate world, that would be called a contingent liability on the balance sheet, and public agencies often refer to those as moral obligations on the balance sheet. It doesn't always require any cash, but it often does allow us to keep our cost of capital down, again, allowing us to get more capital into our purchase or our build. From a policy and practice standpoint, I cannot stress enough how wonderful this evening is and things like this that help to educate all decision makers at all levels, elected officials, city staff, and the citizenry. If they all understand the issue and why affordable housing is needed. I believe it was John who mentioned that we were all renters at one time. And I would go one step further and say, you know, we've spent the last year talking about essential workers and frontline workers, and a lot of these folks are the very folks that rent and that need affordable housing. And if we want to keep these essential workers in our community, we need to have a place for them to live in stable housing. And helping people to understand that issue before there's a specific transaction being discussed is really important. And the other element that is so important is clarity of priorities, clarity of policies, and clarity of process. Developers need to understand what the priorities are in a particular city or a particular county so that they know if they can deliver what the community needs. And equally important, the community needs to know if that developer is lining up with what the community has identified as a priority. And if there's not clarity there, there are a lot of developers or long-term owners like Aeon who will find it difficult to take the time and the cost necessary to pursue projects because there's no certainty that we know how to get to the finish line with the development or with the purchase. Lastly, I would just point out that there's a really important role that communities can play, and that is helping to build relationships. It is really important to start talking with the legacy owners of building and also owners of land to talk about when they are ready to sell. It may not be next Tuesday, it could be 3 years from now, but when they are ready to sell, they need to know that there are folks like Aeon or other affordable housing developers and owners that would be interested in acquiring those properties and keeping them affordable. And the flip side of that is cities and communities know very well who the troubled properties are and who the owners are of those properties. And so to start to build relationships with them so that we can solve some community properties by coming forward to acquire those properties is another way that is helpful in making housing stay affordable. And the last two bullet points here are really related. You know, you can identify which properties are going to be important to that urban fabric that Andrew talked about, and the need for creating the right mix of housing and the right kind of commercial development and the right kind of public spaces. But you can't do that if the really important key catalyzing sites are quickly sold to the market and not developed in a way that actually makes those other important things happen. And so cities can step in to acquire those properties, in effect land bank them, and make sure that the right kind of use, the right kind of developer, the right kind of owner is going to come in and do all of the things that the community wants that property to do in order to achieve the long-term goals for the overall area, not just that individual property. And in keeping with that, and Stephanie, I would just say, Edina is had done a wonderful job in helping us on this interim ownership idea. We had identified a property in Edina for affordable housing, and just the length of time it takes to go through the funding application and cycle necessary to get all of the pieces in place. Owning land costs us a significant amount of money. The carry costs for taxes, the carry costs for insurance and other things can add a significant amount to the overall project costs that we are trying to fund. And in the case of Edina, they stepped in and acquired the property so that we wouldn't have those carry costs. And once we had lined up all of the funding and all of the other important elements to move that project forward, we bought the property from the city, and they effectively helped us to close the gap because we didn't have to cover the cost of all those carry costs. So these are just some examples of ways in which communities can help to make affordable housing happen. The last thing I would say is timing is the issue. The market rate buyers can act quickly. They have nimble capital and they are not following the traditional city or county cycles for approvals and for funding allocation. And that is really important to keep in mind, because if you want to compete with the market, timing is as important as price. Thank you. Barbara, you're on mute. I'm not the only one that does that.
Thank you. I was going to say, Sarah, you've helped set up the introduction for Stephanie about what cities are doing, and Jeanne is also with a city. So our last two presenters are municipal leaders. So thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you. And Gretchen, if you'll queue up, thank you. Next slide. So I'm giving a little bit of background information of why we march towards the path of really looking at affordable housing. And we just finished up our housing task force that met for 18 months, and we finished up in December. So kudos to you all. And I'm showing some of these slides because I feel like they will resonate with some folks in White Bear, not just to toot our own horn or anything like that. So housing prices are increasing, and cities need to step in. As you can see, the Edina median price of a home here is over $450. This was in 2019. It is now like over $500,000 is the median price. Next slide, please. Another issue why we need to look at affordable housing is to be open and inclusive and welcoming to all folks. Mapping Prejudice in Hennepin County did a big study where they showed that there are racial covenants on properties. Edina is not immune to that. All the red parcels had racial covenants on them. We just recently joined the Just Deeds project, but it's reality everywhere. We are diversifying. We are changing. The 1950s is no longer here. We are in a new era, and as Sarah was mentioning, with there's a lot of folks too that are cost burdened with these increased housing costs. And when you're spending all your money on housing, you're not spending them at the local restaurant or the grocery store or the coffee shop or the hairdresser or the gas station. You are spending them on housing. And so it's actually an economic development tool to get people to be able to spend less money on their housing costs so they can spend more of it elsewhere. Next slide. So I just did, demonstration of need. The picture on the left shows minimum wage and how it's changed over time, which we know it has not very much. And then the change in annual salary needed in order to buy an average priced house in Edina. And perhaps it was not an intention that a median income earner would be able to buy a home, but even back as recently as 1985, the gap between minimum wage and a wage needed to buy a home was much closer than it is in 2020. Then the slide on the right shows the top line is the annual mortgage payment. And then the lines underneath are the largest industries in Edina and what their wages are. So even back, and this just goes back 20 years. So in 2020, you can see the yellow line is public administration. Someone like me could conceivably own a home in Edina, but over time that has become increasingly less likely. And this is true in all these communities. And I think if White Bear did the same type of study, you'd be able to make the same type of slides. Next slide, please. So we looked at, every city has to do a comp plan. Every comp plan has the affordable housing goals. So between 2010 and 2020, 100% of our affordable options were rental. So that means 0% were ownership. 7% of rental being built was affordable. And then 0% of the affordable options were ownership. So what this basically says is that, yeah, there was some affordable being built. It was all rental, but it was still a small percentage of the rental. Next slide, please. So another need why we decided that affordability and looking at housing was important, there are three main drivers. One was citizen driven. We do these housing surveys, and every year it came up that affordability is an issue for residents in the community. One was data driven. Prior to COVID, 40,000 people were traveling into Edina each day for work. So you're talking about climate change, you're talking about congestion on roads, you're talking about all these other issues get tied into this. If people were able to live closer to work, maybe there'd be less congestion. But if the more people are seeking affordable housing, they're going further and further out, farther and farther, excuse me. And it just adds to more cars on the road. And I threw in there 42% of Edina renters are cost burdened. And as I said earlier, and Sarah indicated this as well, when they're spending all their money on housing, they're not spending it elsewhere. And then it's mandate driven. We have to answer to the Metropolitan Council. Next slide, please. So in 2015, we adopted an affordable housing policy. Basically, it says it's for all new multifamily housing, saying that a percentage of the rental units needed to be affordable. 10% had to be affordable at 50% of area median income, or 20% of the units had to be affordable at 60% of median income. And then we added a buy-in option. Some developers, quite honestly, in some places, maybe affordability doesn't make sense. Or maybe the owner and the management company is just completely ill-equipped to deal with affordable housing. So we had a buy-in option that was added in 2018. 2019, they hired me. I'm the first housing person that the city has had. That year, we also, to our affordable housing policy, added the affirmative fair marketing clause that if you're going to get money from us or you're building multifamily, you have to affirmatively market it. You have to try to reach populations that are underrepresented in the city. We also added a non-discrimination of housing choice vouchers, and we created a policy guide to really help the owners and managers. In 2021, we reduced the sales price on what it means to be affordable, so we made that actually lower, and we increased the buy-in amount. So we, prior to 2015, we had very, very little affordable housing built. since then, and now our numbers have increased substantially. Next slide, please. So Sarah also mentioned this. I guess she was queuing me up. We just started in 2019 proactively acquiring land. The council was hesitant about it. We did some surveys with neighboring communities that if we want to fulfill these housing goals, we had to mix it up in the marketplace. We had to go, not just wait for developers to come to us, but if a parcel or a building were for sale, that we had to compete with the private market and try to secure that property for our housing goals. So one example of this, we lent to our Edina Housing Foundation $3.65 million to buy a office building for the purpose of demolishing that building to make way for 118 units of age-restricted affordable housing. And the land is being contributed through a land lease to make the property affordable for 99 years. Our policy says for 20 years, but because of this structure and because the city council is willing to start proactively acquiring land and securing it for this goal, we are able to add, be a little bit more creative, and we're able to get this affordable for 99 years. Next slide, please. So some people are like, well, why do a buy-in? You know, housing advocates are like, just do the affordable housing. You need the units. I actually like the buy-in. It gives you some options. It's a very flexible source of money. I call it, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. I started a ton of pilot projects just to see, what's going to take and what's not going to take. One is the 4D program to encourage NOAA property owners to maintain affordability. We've only had one taker, but he extended his affordability period from 2 years to 12 years on his own. He just said, hey, I like this. I like having a property tax break. I want to expend my time. Can I do it? And we're like, yeah, sure. You want to expend it, make sure your property stays affordable? Go for it. We have a partnership with the land trust to acquire properties. We're lending them. We created a line of credit so they can go out and buy properties, place them on land trust, and part of our line of credit turns into a grant once the properties are bought and sold to a buyer. We're working on a reduced property tax obligation for land trust properties, copying pretty much what Minneapolis is doing. We provided a $2 million grant to Metro HRA to expand their affordable housing program. So these will be rental programs, but they hadn't increased their portfolio in Edina for 16 years. So we decided we needed to help those Section 8 households. So we provided a grant. A lot of this is using buy-in funds. Some is using pooled TIF money. And then we have our Come Home to Edina Second Mortgage Program. We've helped about 121 homeowner buyers buy property in Edina through a very robust second mortgage program. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm talking so fast, but I know I have limited time. So one thing that took off, shocking us really, was we sent out a postcard to every homeowner that owned a property that was valued up to $425,000. And we were experiencing a lot of tear downs. And we said, listen, basically you have two options right now. You can fix up your house, put it on the market, make sure it's all pristine and you have open houses and you have all these people walking through and you have to keep your house clean and store your pets somewhere and put away the toys, or you're selling it to a builder who says, we'll buy it as is, you don't have to do any of the fix up. But a lot of those homes, we lost almost 1,000 homes to tear downs in the past 10 years. And we're like, okay, we're going to provide you with a third option. You have good memories in your home. You don't want to sell it to a builder, but you don't want to deal with all the hassle of marketing and on the market. We'll buy it. Come to us. We'll look at it and we'll buy it. We partnered with the land trust. This is a line of credit we gave them. Phone was ringing off the hook with people interested in this program. I mean, it was nuts. I never expected that. And we are in the process of buying 4 homes. We just rolled out the program like a couple months ago. I'm hoping to expand it. And this is to be able to preserve some of those more moderate priced homes, save them from the landfill, basically. And some of the homes that are being passed over by the land trust, these will be the ones that maybe can go to the Metro HRA. Next slide. So we also, part of looking at affordable housing is different policies that also help existing renters or existing residents. So we passed in the past couple of years the fair housing policy. I mentioned the non-discrimination of housing choice voucher holders, affirmative fair housing marketing plan I mentioned. We started a rental licensure program to help the most vulnerable. Basically, complaints where we address complaints in rental housing. You know, if someone called on and said, hey, there's something really off with my building, I need you to come and look at it. But the thing is, people that are secure in the housing make those complaints. Those who are fearful that they're going to lose their rare opportunity to actually be in an affordable housing unit, they're not going to call. The smoke detector may not work. They may have cracks in their window, but they're not going to call because they do not want to lose this shelter. So we created this licensure program so we can be more proactive and help those residents. We provided a fair amount of money for emergency rental assistance. We created a program for forbearance relief, and we now have pending a tenant protection policy. Next slide. Lessons learned, compliance. You know, it's easy to do a policy, seeing that it's actually being implemented and that owners are renting the units at the caps that include parking and utilities. And that they're doing income verification of the renters, the tenants. That's a whole different game. So we have hired a third party to do income and rental verification with everyone that falls under our policy. So that's Affordable Housing Connections. So that's one of the lessons learned. And I think, is that it? Yep, that's it. I hope I meet my 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Jeannie, we're going to have you do a presentation. I also just want to let people know we're eating into some of our Q&A, but we think that the presentations are critical to the information people are seeking. And we are keeping track of all the questions, and we'll follow up with many answers as we can. So, Jeannie.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, first of all, Stephanie, great job for Edina being so progressive, especially with your median value home being as high as it is. It has to probably be one of the highest in the metro area. I want to, why don't you go to our next slide? And I'm going to be very brief. I think that there's a lot of commonalities to Roseville as there is to White Bear Lake. One of the things that we've done, and we started doing this back in 2012, and then we updated it in 2015, and then we recently did it again in 2018 and helped to guide us, was we did a comprehensive housing needs assessment. We wanted to know what is missing in our community and what is some of the things that we should be paying more attention to, especially when those projects come in the door for asking for financial assistance. We have and developed a financial assistance policy. So that was pretty much the groundwork that was done back in 5 years ago in order to help also guide developers. But then this market housing needs assessment does. From that, just in 2018, as you can see, our market rate rental, that was one of our largest priorities because it had been over 35 years since Roseville had had any new construction of market rate in our community. And it was very difficult for market rate developers who wanted to build market rate to come in because there was no comparables in order for them to get the financing. So that became, and we're very happy that one of those projects is under construction and should be completed this October and will be and have those amenities that many of our market rate projects in Roseville do not have. We also were missing affordable rental. We did not have a lot built over the last 10 years. And happy to announce that we finally have a new construction, 228 units. We also, though, prior to that had another project, and John was part of this. And they did our first units of 60 units since the last 10 years as well. All these projects are great. And what I'm really happy to say is that one thing that was unique to us is that we actually had about 70 acres that were not developed in Roseville. It was part of an estate. One of John's projects ended up being 10 acres of that estate. Out of all those 70 acres, only that 10 acres has been developed into affordable housing. The rest were all market, and the rest were no public financial assistance needed. because they went and geared themselves to what the market demanded in our area, which was more senior housing, rental, and also for sale. So that was our only remaining opportunity for new construction of for sale, other than redevelopment sites. I would also say that so from that, we identified multifamily of 220 units. And as you can see, we only have 26 under construction at this time over the last few years, and really don't have too many sites left in order to accommodate that in Roseville, as well as single family homes. Why don't you go to the next slide? And then why don't we go, one thing that I want to mention about affordable home ownership is that has been identified as a big key in our community. And one of the things that our market study identified is that we should be gearing affordable housing for home ownership. And we have not really figured a way to do that, other than we really should have been in implementing an inclusionary housing policy. That would have really helped us identify ways to have maybe made some of those home ownerships affordable, or actually, as Stephanie and their community did, is they got involved in acquiring some property in order to make it what they want it to be. So we are missing affordable home ownership, and the only affordable home ownership that we have opportunity going forward is that we currently have an existing program where we buy maybe homes that should not have any more reinvestment done into them, and then acquire them, demolish the home, and then put it up for opportunity to have a new home built on. That way we can control the community of that home blending into the existing neighborhood. And we've done a few of those over the last, I want to say 20 years, but not as many as we would have liked to have probably done. And then why don't we go to the last slide, next slide. I think the biggest thing that you're hearing from all of us tonight is setting up the framework. What are the city's priorities? What are those areas? What are those elements? And then how about the zoning? The zoning needs to match what those city priorities are. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if your zoning doesn't match it, it's really difficult for a developer to come in and meet the city's priorities, because they may have to go through a rezoning, which also brings a lot of contentiousness. The policies also are very important to send a clear message, as Sarah related to, what does the community want, and what do they want to support, and what do they want to see as a vision and a need in their community. The other asset, and I want to clearly say this, is when you provide financial assistance as a community, you also can get some things back for the community. Because of that relationship that you're developing with the developer, it sometimes can broaden a larger plan for a redevelopment site. And then I also would say that looking at removing some of those obstacles for your city's priority in redevelopment areas, especially the environmental contamination. And John mentioned earlier tonight that White Bear has a lot of brownfield sites, as well as Roseville had. And I'm going to show you one of those quick sites at the end. And so that is part of that leveraging of other funding sources. Stephanie even hit onto that with other funds through the Met Council and so forth. And then also too, sometimes as a community, you may need to take legislative action. If there is something that you want to do and there isn't the capability to do it, we went in and actually extended and asked of the time for the legislation on an existing TIF district, because nothing had happened into it. And that is one of the last next slides I'm going to go into is, go to the next slide, is that this was one of our largest redevelopment sites in Roseville. That was an old trucking terminal. And as you can see, it was up against a beautiful park of ours and amenities of the lake. And we call this our Twin Lakes redevelopment area. It took, unfortunately, when the market went south after 2007, when we did all the things that the city needed to do in order to set up the site for redevelopment, the economy went into the wrong direction. And then that's where we had been proactive setting up some of this opportunities and for financing and getting projects. And the biggest thing that I want to say on this site was making sure that the zoning was going to get us what we wanted. The zoning was a community mixed use, so it allowed for a multitude of housing opportunities as well as a reinvestment for businesses. And so there was several phases that we did over the time that we did go after grants, and also Betty McAuliffe went and got us some money as well in order to do some of this when the economy went. But why don't we go to the last slide? Because that is where, like I've said, our Twin Lake Station is 21 acres, and it's right now having 228 affordable family housing, as well as 277 affordable senior housings that are going to start construction this summer. That to us is very exciting because we don't have a lot of affordable senior in Roseville. The marketplace has been taking care of that for rental for market senior, but not the affordable. And then I also would say that this is also the just west of that Twin Lake Station is then the parcel that was our first market rate, and that's another 10 acres. It had a new terrain dermatology, so business. We ended up providing that business with a subsidy as well as the construction of the apartment building. And then we also worked with one of our largest employers in Roseville to maintain them in Roseville and keep them. The biggest thing that you will find is it's not only about keeping your employers in town, it's also about providing a place for those people that work for those employers to live in your community as well. And so that's why we believe that housing is economic development, and it is a way to sustain your businesses and help your businesses grow as well. I'm done. Thank you.
Oh, terrific. Thanks, Jeanne. There are a couple of questions I think we could just get to quickly. So one person asked, Stephanie, what's a buy-in option? You said you included that. Could you just tell people what that is?
Yes. So with inclusionary housing policies, or people, in some communities, it's inclusionary zoning ordinance, developers of market rate apartments have to include a certain percentage or a certain number of affordable. And different communities have defined that in a variety of different ways. We allow, it's a payment in lieu. We call it a buy-in. I don't know why we do, it just is, but it's a payment in lieu. So a developer, instead of providing the affordable units, they have to pay $125,000 per unit of 10% of the units they're developing. So if it's a 220 unit building, they would provide it used to be 100,000. Can't do the math in my head, but over $2 million of payment in lieu. And then that money is pretty unrestricted. And then that's when I can do all those different types of pilot programs.
Terrific. Thank you. We have 3 questions from our panel and one from tonight about community engagement, community information. How do you talk to people who aren't yet in the process? So do any of you have tips about that? Communication with people who haven't been included, or outreach, or how you might do some of that? Well, I didn't mean to make it so hard. So, all right. So just know that that's on people's minds. How do you get people engaged and involved? I think, Stacie, I want to come back to you too. People, and I thought I heard you say that TIF is financially viable and that the city gets back. I thought at one point you said 3 to 1, but can you talk a little bit more about if that's an investment the city's making? Has it been economically viable for the city?
Well, I would say any reinvestment in your community makes it economically viable. So when you look at your rating, all cities have a bond rating when they go out and issue debt, which the city of White Bear Lake does. You know, one of the key factors of the things of the rating agency is redevelopment that's happening in the community. So they see that investment as key and critical to actually happening to, sustain values into the future. And as we say with any tax increment district, it's a short-term investment for a long-term gain. Now, a TIF district for housing can go up to 26 years. They don't all go that long. And to a lot of us, 26 years could seem like a long time, but I've been doing this 30 years, so I've lived through several full life cycles of TIF districts, and to see some of those projects that were done that long ago that are still standing and look great today, yes, it's a great investment for community.
Terrific, thanks. Is there a standard for if the city makes a commitment to increase its affordable housing, either rental or purchase? Is there a percentage or a way that you think about it? I mean, I think Stephanie, you just mentioned it's a certain percentage of the units being built. Is there a standard process for that, or is it really negotiated with each developer?
We have it as a standard, and I think a lot of communities that have a policy or an inclusionary zoning ordinance have a standard. I think I think it'd be problematic to have it negotiated with each developer. There may be concerns of favoritism or some other issues, but if you look at communities that have these, they're all different. But when we looked at what our percentages were, we looked at similar cities throughout the country and what kind of what their ordinances or policy stated. I would really caution against having it be negotiated project by project. I think that is a headache.
Okay, and Jeannie, you're nodding. Is that the same experience for Roseville?
Well, no, because we don't have an inclusionary policy, but and actually in our community, we were just happy that we were having finally some new affordable housing coming forward, and also market rate, knowing that those two being in our community blended in one development is very hard for developers to make work financially. And so that is somewhat why we haven't done an inclusionary policy, but I think it would have played a better role for us in like the for sale market for us to figure out a way to meet some of those housing need goals.
And I would just add that, you know, it's in the higher end communities that you're seeing the inclusionary zoning policies, because land is at a premium. It costs more there for various reasons. So that's why there's just probably a few select communities in the metro that are actually doing that.
Terrific, thank you. It's 8:22 and we wanted to give each presenter an opportunity to have a last word or to offer some advice or help advise about some priorities. So White Bear Lake needs more housing generally. Its vacancy rate is below what is considered the right percentage. It wants to preserve and add to existing affordable housing for that life range, Andrew, that you talked about. There's a demand for more diversity, and we have comments from many people about I couldn't find what our family needed, and so there's more demand than product, and there's a need for more diversity in that lifespan piece, and certainly affordability. But this is a community that also cares very much about its identity and its cultural components, and wants to find ways to make the community more walkable or more aesthetic, or to not kind of get way out of line when they add new housing. So whatever advice you have for them, we've got a couple minutes for each of you to offer some suggestions, final comments. Stacie, we can start with you.
Yep, I'll jump in first, happy to. What I would say to the task force, which is a message that would get carried forward to the policymakers and the folks that make budgetary decisions, is that if you want to make a dent in doing anything for housing or to do anything related to housing, you have to invest. So you're going to have to set aside dollars or find dollars. You can't expect it just to all come from somebody else or be just all tax increment. So again, looking at levy options to actually put dollars aside, because those tend to be the most unrestricted, to really start and build a pool of money that you can start doing programs with.
Terrific, thanks. Andrew, you were second, and you talked a little about design and preserving the identity of the community.
Sure. I actually would encourage not necessarily preserving the identity of a community, but gently evolving the identity of a community. I think that's a healthier way to look at it. The other thing, and I guess, my concluding comment is for communities and the community and the development community to sort of rally around the word or the idea about how new housing can contribute to a better community. It's got to be more than just, you know, a place to live, for it to be welcomed into the community. I sometimes think of it like, you know, going to a dinner party, if you will. If you want to be a welcome guest, you sort of have to understand the setting, and at the same time, the guest needs to sort of open up and be welcome to new conversations. So to the degree that communities and developers can focus on what it is that contributes to the community, I think new housing is going to be more welcomed.
Terrific, thanks. John?
I don't have anything to add. All these panelists are smarter than me, so I'm going to let them use my time. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Sarah.
I don't know about that, John. I disagree wholeheartedly, but I would just make two comments. Number one, all housing is at risk of being lost from an affordability standpoint. And if we don't want to become one of the coastal cities where people are driving 2-3 hours to get to their jobs, then we need to start paying attention to the housing before it's too late. And the second thing I would say is we need to be really smart about looking at the housing in our community and making sure that the life cycle that Andrew had a lovely slide about is being thoughtfully applied to how we're doing housing, because we need to make sure that we have places where older people can move to downsize so that we can free up their larger single family homes for the new families that are coming in. We don't have to just build our way out of this. We actually have to be smart about that continuum of housing that's needed in every community.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Stephanie, do you have any last comments?
Yeah, I think one of the things that needs to be kept in mind is this isn't a zero-sum game. It's not that if you are welcoming and building new and different and evolving type of housing, that your history and your neighborhoods are lost, and the thing that you love about your community gets lost. It's not an either or. You can have both. And I think that's really hard for some people to come to terms with, that is that both there's room for both. You can have your beautiful, lovely, traditional neighborhoods and welcome new types of housing and be more welcoming and inclusive.
Terrific, thanks. Jeanne, any final comments?
I would ditto everything that everyone else said, but recognize that the city is a tool, and you want to build your tool chest. As Stacie Kvilvang has always told us and helped us, building your tool chest in order to do what you want to do, and whether it be an HRA levy or EDA levy. And we did start with an HRA levy in 2002 and then created an EDA in 2016, and then started levying in 2017 and rolled our HRA into our EDA. We still levy only one of our entities, but we still could do both if we wanted to. We built that opportunity over these last 20 years, which has allowed us to do a lot of reinvestment in our community for home ownership, opportunities for reinvestment, being a lender of last resort, as well as us extending into other loan programs that we're now making a priority in our community finally this year, as well as on the multifamily side of things. The community can get back something from being a partner as well. And if it's something that you have in your comprehensive plan or in your zoning plan for that connectivity from a development or an area, and a development is coming in, it's an opportunity to figure out how to make that rest of that connection happen from a development that's coming forward. So partnership is a very key important of a city.
Terrific, thanks. We did have someone ask if they could get a list of all the policies people have put in place or the presentations from tonight, and I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to remind people that the second meeting is September 9th. And then I'll just ask, is it Ellen or Anne or somebody who wants to make final comments on behalf of the city?
Sure, I could just jump in here. I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank the talent of my colleagues from peer communities that have shared their insight, the private sector developers and the designers who help, just really open our eyes. I think I kept looking over at Tracy and Ellen, who are sharing the dais with me here this evening. Just really healthy conversation tonight. It's going to give us a lot of things to discuss with our task force to come up with priorities and policies, because there's a plethora of tools out there that are available. However, it will likely be baby steps as we move towards this and march towards, creating not only a housing policy, but then implementing perhaps some funding sources and then implementing some minor requirements as we move forward. I think
Great. And Gretchen, do you want to just reinforce how people hear about this, and they'll get the presentations and they'll get an invitation to the next one? Just kind of the details of what's going to happen next.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for attending tonight. We will be sure to be sharing any future opportunities to participate in this conversation. We will be reaching out to you for the upcoming session in September. We really would appreciate your thoughts and reactions to the work that the task force has done and help them guide their final recommendations to the city. So we look forward to having future discussions. Thanks, everybody.